Yes. Hello and welcome back to these talks on the 4 books. Today is actually our final session on the highest learning, and we look forward to starting the Analects of Confucius next week. So in these talks, we've covered the first 3 of the actions that you see in blue here. The very top priority is actually detecting our thoughts and then evaluating them. Are they for self or for others, which is called perfecting knowledge. And then following through on that is called making intention sincere. Today, we'll cover this particular action, which is rectifying the mind. So let's take a look at this passage. It's actually very short, or relatively short rather. And so what I'll do is I'll first read it out, and then we'll analyze it part by part. So it states, what is meant by cultivating the self lies in rectifying the mind. Oneself will not be rectified when angry, will not be rectified when fearful, will not be rectified when delighted, and will not be rectified when anxious. When the mind is not focused, one looks but does not see, listens but does not hear, and eats but knows not the taste. This is what is meant by cultivating the self lies in rectifying the mind. So you can see here the 2 key words are self and mind. Now, when we think of the self, we tend to think of the physical self, right? Our body and what we experience. So this physical body. So we might think of these expressions. But clearly, what's important is what we don't see, what's on the inside, our thoughts and our feelings. And when we think of the mind, we might think of these expressions. Now, if you look at these expressions, you'll realize they're actually the root cause of the first set, aren't they? Because there's no way that we can feel more energetic if we're always worried and stressed, nor can we be more fit if we're not motivated. So the mind is the master of the body. Now, why is there a distinction between action 5, cultivating the self, and rectifying the mind? So there's a distinction between self and mind here in the highest learning. Well, the self is the interface between the inner world and the outer world. So it's the self, the physical self, through our words and our conduct that then relate to others around us, in the family, at work, and ultimately in the community and beyond. But the self, as you can see, also encapsulates the first 4 levels of thoughts, knowledge, intentions, and mind. So we have to look at the context. So self can sometimes mean the physical self, and it can also encapsulate the mental side of ourselves. Now, with that in mind, let's look at this particular word here that I've highlighted in red. It says oneself. Oneself will not be rectified when angry, fearful, delighted, or anxious. And if you look in the Chinese, this character is, interestingly enough, the same character as cultivating the self, isn't it? So the oneself here, does it refer to the physical self or the mind? Now, if you're finding this question challenging, you're not the only one. In the 12th century, the Neo-Confucian scholar Zhu Xi, he wrote in his commentary that this oneself should actually be a heart-mind. Why? Because clearly we're talking about emotions, anger, delight, etc. So these emotions come from within. So he thought that it should actually be read as the heart-mind here. Professor Li Bingnan actually argues against this and writes that the 2 characters, self and mind, look very different. It's not just the case of 1 or 2 strokes being different. It's very different. So it can't be that they've been copied wrong over the generations. However, yes, the 4 terms are emotions, but these emotions can also be expressed through ourselves, through the physical self. For example, when we're angry, When we're angry, our face changes, the tone of our voice changes, and our actions become more dramatic, don't they? Now, it's not just the emotions that can be expressed through ourselves. We talked about last week how sincerity from within can also be manifest without. So it can be obvious to those around us that we have sincere thoughts, right? So Professor Liebenthal believes that self here, leaving it as the self, makes sense. It shouldn't be changed to heart mind. Now, I'm sure the question that you might have is, well, what do we mean by the mind then? Because he even says here, the four terms, these emotions are not of the original heart mind. So the heart mind in Chinese, Xing, can often be translated as the heart mind, both heart and mind, because in Chinese philosophy, there's no duality between the emotional side of ourselves and the rational side of ourselves. This heart mind is the seat of our emotions, our mental states, facts, figures, etc., all the thoughts that are whirling around in our inner world. And so Professor Liebenthal makes the distinction between two types of mind. The original heart mind, which is in complete accordance with the enlightened virtue, and the human heart mind, which is really the original heart mind, but it's concealed by thoughts of self. So our selfishness. And when I read about this, and obviously it's not simply what Professor Liebenthal says, that many scholars throughout the generations have also said the same thing in terms of these two minds. But when I read this, I thought of this English expression that we have, which is that we can be at two minds, which is when we're unsure about something. And it reflects very well this idea of, being conflicted, is it for ourselves or should we do it for others? And clearly, when we are at two minds, we need to rectify the mind. And rectifying the mind refers to rectifying the heart mind, the human mind rather, not the original mind, of course, because that is already in keeping with our innate moral goodness. So what does it mean to rectify? Well, when we look at the form of this character, according to the Shuowenjiezi, China's first lexicon, it tells us that it's made of two parts, a top and a bottom. The bottom character means stop or rest. We said resting in utmost goodness is the same character. And on the top, it means one. You can see it's one stroke. So what does it mean to rest in one? Definitely doesn't mean to stop in a physical space, to keep in the same spot, nor does it mean to stubbornly cling to our one viewpoint. What it means is to remain in a oneness. And this oneness is a wholeness of experience, a wholeness with us, ourselves, others, and the environment, and all things. So it's a harmony with all things. Now, starting to get a little abstract. So let me talk about it in terms of a specific example. Now, the Dizagui we're all familiar with. There's a line here that talks about how when eating, drinking, walking, or sitting, let elders do so first, younger ones follow. Now, it sort of makes you think of this give way sign to the elderly people, doesn't it? But imagine that you're having dinner with your family, with your parents, grandparents, at the dinner table, the food is being served, and you're really hungry, so you just want to start eating. Well, there's part of you that says, well, just start eating. But the other part of you, the original mind, is telling you, wait a minute, doesn't Dizagui tell us we have to wait for our elders to go first? We should make sure that they go first. And so you're at two minds, and you have to evaluate these thoughts, perfect your knowledge. When you make a decision on the right course of action to wait, then that's to make intention sincere. You follow through on that. Your mind is rectified, and you'll be cultivated because you won't be reaching out with your hand to get the food for yourself first. As a result, there are flow-on effects. Your family will be harmonious because everyone feels respected, and you've done your duty as a child. Your parents will be proud of you. So this it's very interesting, this whole flow, isn't it? That when you rest in this oneness is not what I think. It's not about a particular other person. It's actually this harmony. The oneness is the harmony, seeing the harmony between ourselves and our elders, and making sure we prioritize that. Now, obviously, when we begin, it might seem like we're following these instructions, these guidelines, and we're consciously following them. We're consciously thinking about, oh, I have to respect so-and-so, I have to respect my elder. But we have to do it until it becomes such a habit that it becomes automatic. And we don't have to think about it. And that's when our intentions are sincere. Like we said last week, it's like when we dislike an offensive smell, when we like a fond sight, beautiful sight, we're fond of it, then that's when our intentions are sincere, because it doesn't require any conscious thought at all. It just happens instinctively. So this is what it's like if we develop these habits of thought. So rectifying the mind clearly is very important to cultivating ourselves. But if this flow is disrupted in any way, then the self will not be cultivated. So if our mind is clouded by emotions, then the self will not be cultivated. And that's why it lists here 4 emotions. And interestingly, there's positive emotions and negative emotions. Now, these different emotions, there's 4, but in the other classical texts, there's different lists. For example, in the Records of Ritual, the Li Ji, it talks about 7 emotions. Now, we're not going to go into the specific details, except to say that it includes both positive and negative emotions. Now, these emotions, as we know, come from within. And in some ways, you might think, well, what are the origins of these emotions, and how is it that we can overcome them so that we can ensure that our mind is rectified? Well, instead of talking about these emotions in an abstract way, what I'd like to do is explore them through a series of stories from the historical texts. And hopefully, through the reactions of these protagonists, we'll be able to understand the emotion and also understand how to manage them. The very first emotion is that of anger. And this story comes from the 6th century in a period of time in Chinese history known as the Sui dynasty. And it's about a very top-level official whose name is Niu Hong. And he was the head of the Ministry of Personnel. And this was one of 6 high-level administrative agencies at the time in the government. So there was the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Rights, the Ministry of Revenue, the Ministry of War, the Ministry of Works, and the Ministry of Justice. So there were only 6, and he was the head of one of them. So this is a very important person. Now, despite his very prominent position, he was very unassuming. He wore the simplest clothes and used the simplest carriage. Despite being well favored by all, he remained respectful to his seniors and caring to his junior colleagues. It's said that he was very, very conscientious. In fact, though he had a very busy work schedule, he would always make time to read the classical texts. And as we've learned by just these few talks on the highest learning, these texts do help us with tools and strategies to navigate our lives, and for him, navigate through a very complex bureaucracy. And so as a result, we're told that he had harmonious relationships with all. And as a person, he was someone who was slow to talk, but efficient in action. Now, this story is not about his work life, it's actually about his home life. And he had a younger sibling who was an alcoholic. One time, his younger brother got drunk and shot or killed his ox, the ox that he used to drive his carriage. Now, just to put it in a modern perspective, this is akin to your younger brother trashing your car. So it was quite a big deal. When he came home from work, his wife was so distressed she immediately reported the incident. But what do you think was his reaction? What would we do if we were in this situation? interestingly, Niu Hong was unaffected in his manner. And he simply said to his wife, just turn it into dried meat. He sat down, opened his book, and started reading as per usual. But his wife was still beside herself with anger and said, your younger brother just killed our ox. He then replied, I already know that, and continued reading as if nothing had happened. So let's think about this. In the past, an ox was quite important property. And, today, if our younger sibling damaged our phone or our laptop, we would be pretty annoyed, let alone our car. So why was it that Niu Hong reacted as if nothing happened? Well, as we know from the Di Zi Gui, when siblings value family ties more than possessions, resentment will not arise. So Niu Hong clearly valued his younger brother over the ox. It's as simple as that. And in some ways, you could say that it wasn't intentional because he was under the influence of alcohol. Now, Niu Hong could have, said a few harsh words to his brother and punished him, but in some ways, he also acted with emotional intelligence because by forgiving, forgetting, and not making a matter out of it, it could have awakened the conscience of his brother, who might have given up drinking for good. So, whether or not that actually happened, what we can see through the story is that Niu Hong rectified his mind. He was unmoved. And why was that? Because he remained in this oneness, this harmony, family harmony, and thinking about the household as an entirety rather than thinking about the feelings of his wife or the fact that he'd lost his property. So that's anger. In terms of fear, we'll often be afraid when we're in a threatening environment. And this story comes from the Jing dynasty, which is around the 3rd and 4th centuries in China. And so once upon a time, there was a 14-year-old girl, and her name was Yang Xiang. And one time she was out in the fields with her father, helping him harvest the crops. And all of a sudden, a tiger appeared from nowhere, leapt onto her father and attacked him. Now, what do you think Yang Xiang did? Well, many of us would have either frozen or ran away screaming. But she does neither of those things. What she does, she pounces on the tiger and uses all her energy to try to strangle the tiger. And the tiger couldn't breathe, was shocked, and released her father and withdrew. So I guess the main question is, why is it that Yang Xiang was not afraid of the tiger? Well, clearly she didn't think about herself. She wasn't afraid for her own life. She only thought about her father. All her thoughts were focused on her father, thinking about his love and thinking about her love for her father. And that's why she was able to be so courageous. If you think about it, a 14-year-old girl would not be, would be much weaker than a tiger. But it was her courage that saved the day and saved her father. So she didn't feel this fear because her thoughts were focused on her father. This next emotion is delight. Now, this is not hard to understand. When we're indulging our senses in food, drink, or music, it's hard to think straight. For example, if we start watching a really good movie, it's hard to walk out halfway, isn't it? So when we're enjoying ourselves, well, our mind is very clouded. And so you can see that delight in itself, even though it seems positive, is actually negative. It's when our mind is not rectified. So this story is about a renowned Confucian scholar of the 2nd century. His name was Ma Rong. And he was so famous that he had over 1,000 students. But he was also quite eccentric. He really enjoyed his music, so much so that while he was teaching, he would set up a muslin screen behind him and have female musicians performing at the same time. So he'd be listening to the music and teaching at the same time. Now, as you can imagine, many of the male students were distracted, but there was one in particular, Zheng Xuan, who wasn't. He was completely focused on what his teacher had to say. Zheng Xuan studied with Ma Rong for 7 years. And after 7 years, when he left, Ma Rong was so certain that he would be successful that he said that my scholarship has now been transmitted to the eastern regions, which is where Zheng Xuan was returning to. Now, the question then is, why was Zheng Xuan not distracted? Well, we know from the historical records that Zheng Xuan, when he was younger, worked as a minor official, but he was dissatisfied with his work. He had this real thirst for knowledge and scholarship, and so he studied at the Imperial Academy and under various teachers before coming to learn under Ma Rong. And his whole mindset was in wanting to understand these classic texts, and wanting to develop his scholarship and understand the way. And so that was his focus. For the 7 years, he studied day and night. He was so diligent. So why was he not distracted? Because he was focused on the learning. He was not thinking about enjoying himself. Now, the next emotion is that of anxiety, which often happens when we feel threatened in some way, when we feel stressed. And it means, of course, that our judgment is hampered. So this story is about a contemporary figure. He's a prominent, or was a prominent, Singaporean businessman, Chen Jiageng, and a very well-known philanthropist. So he donated a lot to public projects, schools, and universities. Now, one time, his son was kidnapped and a ransom was demanded. How did he react? Well, he actually didn't give the abductors a cent. And he told them that all his money was for the community and not for his sons. The abductors had no choice but to release his son. I guess the main question for all of us is, well, why was he not anxious? Why did he not pay the ransom? Well, in some ways, he had nothing to hide and nothing to lose, because he'd actually pledged all his money to the community, and it was, in fact, public property. Therefore, it wasn't something that he could use for his personal or family purposes. So his property, the abductors thought that it was his, but actually he said that it was for the public. Now, you can see, of course, that these various emotions, there's a single underlying theme. So, for example, when we're enjoying ourselves, when things are going our way, we feel delighted, we feel happy. When things are unfavorable, when we don't get our way, then we become angry. And if our lives or our interests are threatened, then we become anxious, or fearful rather. And if we feel like we're at risk of losing something, like our money, then we might be anxious. So you could say the common underlying factor in all of these is thinking about ourselves and our interests. Then what happens is that when the thought arises, this thought of ourself goes undetected. When it's undetected, our knowledge is not perfected, our intentions are not sincere, our mind is not rectified, then we're not cultivated. So you can see the priority is in the very first step, which is to cultivate or detect these thoughts. Now, during the day, on a moment-to-moment basis, our emotions are being drawn out from us depending on what happens to us and who we meet. And if we don't detect these thoughts, then we become a slave to our emotions. We are controlled by our emotions. So much so that, we might feel immediately stressed when we see something or lash out at others and don't even know why. So that's why it says rectifying the mind is so important as a precedent to cultivating the self. Now, these emotions obviously stem from the mind, but they also hijack our senses and change our perceptions. So that's why it says, when the mind is not focused, when it's beset with emotions, one looks but does not see, listens but does not hear, and eats but knows not the taste. So in terms of looking but not seeing, I'm sure we've all had the experience when we've been in a rush, we're really stressed out, we're trying to find something on our desk and we can't find it. And then when everything's over, I'm back relaxed, it's sitting right there in front of us as if where it was originally meant to be. But we couldn't see it when we were stressed because our minds were so anxious. So that's looking but not seeing. Now that on another level, of course, looking and not seeing is when we're caught up in ourselves and we don't really see the other person. So let me give you an example. In the Deeds Way, it tells us that in the morning we should greet our parents and show them that we care. At night, we should make sure that they are resting comfortably. So this occurs in one of the first pages of this text. And I'm sure that, when we're younger, when we're living with our parents, we would always greet them in the morning and check how they slept last night. But what happens if they look tired, but they actually tell us that they slept fine? If we pick up on the fact that they looked tired, we should actually think further. Because how we sleep, or the quality of our sleep, is actually a very good indicator of our health. During the day, our mind is preoccupied, and so aches and pains and itches are sort of masked. But at night, when our mind is unoccupied, oftentimes these come out, and that's why it affects our sleep. So poor quality sleep is actually an indicator of something physical, or it could be that we're really worried about something. So when we see our parents, when we look at our parents, do we really see them? Can we understand their body language, their facial expressions, and know what they're thinking? It's not just simply greeting them, it's actually caring and looking further than that. There's this interesting English word, which is perspicacious, and it's defined as having a ready insight into and understanding of things. And interestingly, it's derived from the Latin word perspicax, which means seeing clearly. And it reminded me a lot of this word in Chinese, ning, which also, as an extended meaning, means to understand something, but is also derived from to see clearly, to illuminate something and hence see clearly. So seeing clearly is not having 20/20 vision. It's actually seeing something and understanding the reason for it. So seeing someone and understanding why they look that way, why they did that, and why things around us happen the way they do. So understanding the underlying reason, that's what we're seeing. If we don't see that, then we're just looking. And it's like when our parents see us. When our parents see us, they see right through us, don't they? We don't have to say a word. We don't have to do anything. But they know something's wrong. We're worried about something. And then they start asking. So this is not some sort of superpower. It's simply because their thoughts are not about themselves at that time. They're thinking about you. They're thinking about us. And they're caring for us. And so this insight and understanding is actually something that we all have. It's an innate wisdom, and it's linked to our innate compassion. It comes about because we care for others. When we care for others, we stop thinking about ourselves, those thoughts of the self, and we're able to really see what's happening in the world around us. So this is to look and to see. Now, what about listening and hearing? Well, I'm sure we've also had the experience when we've sort of listened to people talking, and then suddenly we think of something we're really worried about. And we start thinking about it and planning and being stressed out. And we can't hear what they said for the rest of the conversation. So again, that's your emotions or your thoughts clouding and affecting your senses. Now, on another level, as it says here in Dizugui, when our parents instruct us, we should listen respectfully. And listen respectfully would mean hearing instead of just simply listening. But it doesn't mean writing down everything they said and memorizing it. It means hearing their underlying concerns. So if they said, if they asked us, did we submit our application for university or our application for the job, what they really mean is, you should get your act together and be more responsible and plan ahead. And possibly that's because we haven't demonstrated these good organizational and planning skills in the past. So that's why they're on our back. They're sort of have to remind us all the time. So we shouldn't feel annoyed that they're nagging us, nor should we just simply report about this particular application. In fact, anytime we do something important, we should report about it. And then after a period of time, they'll realize that we are organized, and they won't have to think for us, and they won't have to nag us and plan for us. And on top of that, more importantly, you'll give them peace of mind. So listening and hearing is actually hearing their underlying concerns and being able to react to that, not simply just the words they say. This is important not only in the home environment with our parents and siblings, but also in the work environment. So all of these skills are translatable and very important. This particular part is a bit more difficult to understand. It says eats but knows not the taste. And I think most of us would think, well, actually, I know if this food is not salty enough or not sweet enough. But this is not what it's getting at. So on a superficial level, if we continue what we would put in the same track as looking and listening, it could be the fact that, when we're stressed for an exam, we tend to, even if we're eating our favorite food, we can't taste it, right? But on another level, look at this cupcake. For a spoiled child, this cupcake will taste like the flavor they don't like. But for a poor child, this might be the only cupcake they eat, in the year. And it's because their parents have given them a treat for once. And they are enjoying the whole taste of the cupcake, but they're also tasting the love of their parents. So it's not simply just the taste of the cupcake, it's what's happening in your mind and what that means. Now, when I read this particular line in The Highest Learning, it made me think of what Confucius said in The Practice of the Mean. He said, everyone eats and drinks, but few are able to know the flavors. Which is sort of the same idea, isn't it? It's actually a metaphor. Hard to understand, but if I put it this way, you might be able to understand more. So it says, everyone eats and drinks, but few are able to know the flavors. And it's just like everyone wakes up and breathes. But how many of us know the meaning of life? So how many of us know how to make the most of every moment and develop ourselves as well as developing others? So if we take these ideas of actually seeing, actually hearing, and really tasting the underlying meanings and messages of the world around us, and we go back to the examples we talked about before, let's look at them again. So the first example was that of the idea of letting elders go first, right? So what do you see? You don't see the food. You don't see the elder. You see the harmony that occurs when there's that mutual respect, underlying respect. That's the way. Now, Niu Hong and his ox, he doesn't hear, well, he hears what his wife says, but he doesn't hear what she wants, which is, to tell off his brother and maybe punish his brother. So what he hears are divisive words, and he responds with unity and harmony, the unity of a forgiving household. Similarly, Yang Xiong, what does she see? Does she see the tiger or her father? She sees her father, and that's what allows her to overcome her fear. Zheng Xuan, He hears the music, yes, but actually he's focused on the words of his teacher. And what he hears is not the words of his teacher, but the scholarship that he's really wants to learn. And that's the focus of his attention. The Singaporean businessman, Chen Xiaokeng, yes, he saw the ransom note, but he also saw the greed that causes people to commit crimes. And he was able to teach them a lesson about giving. So you can see here that when we're not caught up in ourselves, then we can understand very clearly what's happening in the world around us. We can see and we can hear. And more importantly, we can respond in ways that are productive, meaningful, and fulfilling for us and for others. So also, if we can do that, it doesn't take much effort or thinking. So we look beyond the specific person, event, or thing. And what we see is this harmony, this oneness, this wholeness of experience, which you could call the way with a capital W or the Dao, or you could call it the enlightened virtue. And if we are true to that oneness, then we are rectifying our mind. If we are sincere to this oneness, then we are making our intention sincere. And ultimately, we are manifesting our enlightened virtue at the same time. So this is about our inner world in terms of our outer world. If we can do that, we will be able to cultivate ourselves and also have better relationships with the people around us. So there's a very common question in terms of this particular passage, and it's related to the idea of anger and delight. So these are two emotions. Now, the question is, how is it different from what we read in the previous passage about making intention sincere and disliking an offensive smell or liking a beautiful sight? Because dislike and like are also emotions, aren't they? Yes, they are emotions, but actually these emotions are not wrong in themselves. Just depends on where they originate from. So if you remember, we talked about the two minds, the original mind and the human mind. So if it originates from the human mind, it's been tainted with our thoughts of the self, and therefore we need to rectify the mind. Those emotions need to be rectified. However, if it's from the original mind, thoughts of for others, then these emotions are fine. Now, if we look at a passage from the Analects, you'll be able to understand this better. In this passage, Zigong almost has the same question as us. He's wondering whether the exemplary person has emotions, whether they also have dislikes. Actually, when he's talking about the exemplary person, he's actually thinking about his teacher, Confucius. Does Confucius have dislikes? So Confucius replies, yes, they dislike those who dwell on the faults of others. They dislike those inferiors who slander their superiors. They dislike those whose courage is not tempered by ritual propriety. They dislike the impulsive and the ignorant. So Confucius has seen right through the question, and he asks Zigong back the same question. Do you have your dislikes? Zigong replies, he does. He hates the plagiarists who pretend to be learned, the arrogant who pretend to be brave, and the malicious who pretend to be frank. Now, I won't go into the details here, except to say that the common denominator for what Confucius dislikes are people who don't work on the root cause of their problems and then blame others. So they dwell on the faults of others or slander their superiors, but also people who don't change themselves and try to change others. Zigong dislikes people who are hypocrites, people who pretend to be something they're not. They deceive others, they deceive themselves, and as a result, they're insincere. Now, yes, we've read this, but what does it mean? Why did Zigong ask this question, and why did Confucius answer in this way? Well, if someone asked us to complete a personal profile of our likes and dislikes, what would we write? Confucius doesn't talk about his favorite food or hobbies. He uses this as a teaching opportunity, teaching, Zigong, and us about the faults that we should avoid. So Confucius is not interested in people learning more about him and what he doesn't like. What he says is actually for the sake of others. So all of these dislikes are for us to know so that we can learn from the lessons. So these dislikes are for others, and that therefore it originates from the original heart mind. So yes, the exemplary person does have emotions, but these emotions can be positive depending on where they arise from. The exemplary person doesn't just have dislikes, they also have likes and hobbies. We know from the story about Sima Huang, the 11th century historian. There's a story from when he was 6 years old, and at that time, for the first time, he heard some stories from the Confucian classic called the Zhuo's Commentary to the Spring and Autumn Annals. And he was so fascinated that he came home and he could retell the stories to his family. And he became such an avid reader of this book that, to the point of not feeling hot, cold, hunger, or thirst. So yes, exemplary people do have their likes and dislikes, but it's just different from ordinary people. So ordinary people generally would be interested in enjoying themselves, money, wealth, fame, and they might pursue this night and day, relentlessly. The exemplary person is interested in virtue and benefiting others, and they pursue this night and day, relentlessly. So the force of the motivation is the same. It's just the direction and the aim is different. So the exemplary person works just as hard, but it's for the benefit of others. So as I said, yeah, this is what is meant by cultivating the self, lies in rectifying one's mind. And you can see obviously the connection between the self and the mind. The next part is to cultivate the self. And we'll see, of course, how that has flow-on effects to the household or the family. So the first part of this passage states, what is meant by regulating the household lies in cultivating the self. People are partial when they're close to those they favour. They're partial when resenting those they view as base. They're partial when revering those whom they fear. They're partial when pitying those they sympathise with, and they're partial when arrogant to those they disdain. Now, before we talked about what the self means and how cultivating it requires rectifying our mind, the household, as we've previously mentioned, refers to the extended family, not the nuclear family. So it could be several generations or several nuclear families living in close proximity. But regulating is a term that we haven't talked about. And when we think about regulating, we think about regulations and rules and punishment. But actually, that's not the case for this particular character. So let's look at the Chinese character. So the Chinese character is what you see on the left here, but on the right side I've shown the ancient script, the oracle bone script, which was used over 3,000 years ago. It's meant to resemble 3 stalks of wheat. Now, don't know if you know, but wheat grows to around the same height. But why is it that the middle stalk appears to be taller than the others? Well, actually, this is because actually, this is because of the rise and fall of the terrain on which the wheat grows. So they are, in fact, even in height. And that's how the character derived its original meaning. And so its original meaning is even or orderly. Now, what does that mean in relation to the household? Well, it means that the household, this extended family, has many different people, They have different roles, different ages, different personalities, different capacities. But creating order means bringing them together and creating harmony between them. And that's just like the different stalks of wheat. They're seemingly different, but actually they come together in an orderly fashion. So regulating the household obviously requires that everyone is able to fulfill their own responsibilities, to work on themselves, cultivate themselves. And that's why it states here that regulating the household lies in cultivating the self. So the rest of this passage is about cultivating yourself. Now, in the previous passage, the focus was on emotions, the inner world. And now this focus is on how we relate to others. And there are 5 scenarios here in which we might experience some bias. So the first scenario is when we're close to people that we favor. So as they say, love is blind. When we, towards our loved ones, we feel particularly close with them, and we might overlook their faults or not even see their faults. We only see their strengths. And this happens a lot when parents have favoritism. So they only favor one child, which means, of course, it's very difficult to be fair and equitable and creates discord in the family. So you can see, of course, that what happens in our minds and what happens, how we relate to others, directly relates to the harmony in the family. The second scenario is when we look down on others and we resent them. So there's a very good analogy or story in the Analects, and it's when Confucius meets with a young person from a village called Huxiang. And this village is notorious because the people there have bad character or poor character. And so the students are confused. Why did Confucius agree to meet with this young person? Aren't they like a hopeless case? So Confucius has to explain himself, and he tells his students that it's not about the background of the person or where they came from, and it's not about what happens when they leave. It's simply about this particular moment when they're sincere. Then as a teacher, they also have to be sincere too and provide the instructions and teachings. So it's that moment. And so you can see, of course, that his students have that bias, whereas Confucius doesn't. And this is, you could say, the opposite of the first scenario, because here, everything that the person does is wrong. They're incompetent. You only see their faults. In the third scenario, it's when we hold someone in high respect and we particularly find it difficult to approach them. Now, it could be, someone in a high position, or it could be a teacher. So yes, it's important to respect your teacher, because respecting your teacher means that you focus more on what they say, you remember what they say more, and you learn more. So it's actually for you. But at the end of the day, if you have questions, you have to ask. It's not questioning your teacher's character or their learning. It's actually because you don't understand what they've said. So it's about the scholarship. So we don't need to feel scared with asking questions, because it's not about them, it's about us. And if we don't understand, then we can't perfect our knowledge and we can't put this into practice. So it's important that we realize that we have this fear or awe, and we get over it so that we can learn. Now, the fourth scenario is when we feel sorry for someone, and then our judgment is clouded as to whether their plight is actually genuine or not. That's also very important to bear in mind. And finally, when we're in a senior position, when we're wealthy, more powerful, it's easy to be arrogant and be dismissive of people, discount their opinions, their ideas, their abilities, and think that we know it all, we have the money, so why do we need to listen to you? So all of these thoughts relate to arrogance. Now, interestingly, Professor Liebignan takes the Song Dynasty commentary as his main commentary, and this is the idea that in all of these scenarios, we are biased or partial. But Professor Liebignan takes it one step further by actually analysing why it is that we are partial. So he discusses it in terms of what's happening in our mind and what's happening in our physical self. So in our mind, we give rise to these various emotions. We favor someone, we look down on someone, we're fearful, we feel sorry for them, we disdain them. And because of that, it means that how we act, what we say to them, is also changes. So as you can see, what happens in our mind affects ourself, which is what we were talking about before. So for example, here, if we hold someone in high respect, we're reverential towards them, that might manifest as, talking softer, talking slower to that person because we really respect them. And all the others, so closeness, resentful, these are meant to be how we conduct ourselves towards the other person. And Professor Liebing-Nan concludes that we have to really reflect on our mind. We have to reflect on these emotions that are causing us to be biased and prejudiced. So he says that at the end of the day, go back to our thoughts. Now, interestingly, he also notes Zheng Xuan's commentary. So Zheng Xuan was the very focused student that we talked about before, but obviously a renowned Confucian scholar. His commentary to the highest learning is the earliest extant commentary that still survives. So his commentary is different, and Professor Liebing-Nan also talks about this. And it's interesting because he teaches us how to cultivate ourselves. So he says here, and this translation is based on his interpretation. So he says, one goes to those they are close to and favors and compares themselves to this person. So goes to is metaphorical. It means that you think about a person that you're close to and you favor, and you think about why it is that you favor them, why you like them. What do they do something special? Is it something they say? And you compare them yourself. You think, do I have these strengths? If not, you should emulate them. That's what it means to compare yourself to them. Similarly, for those that you look down on and resent, you should also do the same. Well, why is it that I don't like this person? Do I have these faults? And if I do, I should change. So same with all the 5 scenarios. So by doing that, it's not about the other person anymore. It's about you and reflecting on yourself so that you can improve yourself and learn from everyone around you, even people that you look down on or you feel disdain for. So Zheng Xuan's interpretation is also very useful for us. And in some ways, although he doesn't address the fact that we are partial biased to this person, he does, in a way, help us with it. Because if we take a step back and objectively analyze this person in terms of their strengths, then we can see that not everyone's perfect and not everyone's imperfect either. So it would also help us with relating to people around us. And ultimately, of course, you can see how difficult it is to do this. The highest learning continues by telling us it's rare to find someone who can love, but know the faults of those they love, hate, but know the strengths of those they hate. And there's a very good story from the times of Confucius, recorded in Master Lu's Spring and Autumn Annals. And it's about a ruler of a state, the state of Jing, Jing Pinggong, so Duke Ping of Jing, who once asked his army commandant, Qi Huangyang, to recommend another general and a commandant, so a more junior position, because these spots have become vacant. And Qi Huangyang recommends his enemy, Xie Hu, to the place of general, and he recommends his son to the place of commandant. And the ruler is very surprised. Qi Huangyang replies that, well, you didn't ask me who my enemy was or who my son was, you just asked me to recommend someone who was capable. And both of these people turn out to be very good for the job. When Confucius heard the story, he praised Qi Huangyang, and he said that this is a person who thinks of, or who puts the state's interests ahead of their personal interests and doesn't disqualify their friend, their enemy, nor their family. And so this is a person who can truly see the faults of those that they love. So he didn't obviously recommend his son for the high position. And at the same time able to see the strengths of those that they hate, so recommended as enemy. And it's something that we can all aspire to be more objective. And certainly this particular line in the Analects explains it well. So the exemplary person harbors no enmities nor affections. They side with what is right. And this what is right is what we referred to before as this oneness, this rectifying our mind and resting in oneness and understanding this. It's not about my way or someone else's way. It's the way that it should be so that everyone is able to flourish and develop and live in harmony. So that's the way with the capital W, or the Tao. Now, ultimately, the highest learning ends with this ancient saying and tells us of two types of people. None knows their children's faults. None knows when their seedlings have reached their limit. So this refers to parents and farmers. Now, everyone knows in the past and even today, parents love their children to bits and can't see their faults. And why is that? Well, it's because the parents see their children as themselves. So if someone criticizes their child, it's like they get criticized. So they get annoyed. And it's very difficult, of course, for us to see our own faults. So that's why they can't see their children's faults. And the other person is the farmer, and they're completely the opposite. When they see their seedlings, it's never good enough. They're never satisfied. They want it to be, they want the seedlings, the plants to grow bigger, faster, more, and so they're never satisfied. So these two types of people can often be biased, as we mentioned before. And so finally, the particular passage ends with a double negative, which really emphasizes the point. So this is what is meant by the self uncultivated, the household will not be regulated. And clearly, if we're biased, then this affects our relationships with people around us. As you can see here, we've covered the first 4 actions. So the idea of how we can manifest our enlightened virtue, which is very important. It's the priority. If we don't do that, we can't help others. Now, that is the most important thing. And today we also covered cultivating the self. And I guess as a final note, it's important to never underestimate each moment in the day, because in each moment we can manifest our enlightened virtue. And also to never underestimate the power of our thoughts, because it's our thoughts that make the world. Thank you very much. Just stop this recording.